They said no good ever comes from opening a door before sunrise. But when 40 knocks landed at once on Willa May Carter's weathered cabin, even fear had to answer. The sound rolled through the pine boards like thunder over dry canyon stone, not one fist after another, but a single impossible summons, as if 40 men had shared one heartbeat. Willa froze beside the cold ash of last night's fire, her bare feet pressed against the rough plank floor, listening to the silence that followed. No voices, no horses snorting, no threats shouted through the dawn, only wind moving dust against the porch. She was 12 years old, alone on a patch of scrubland most folks rode past without seeing, and every warning she had ever heard about Apache warriors rose in her mind at once. Her hand trembled as she lifted the latch. The door opened 1 inch, then 2, and through the crack she saw them. 40 riders stood motionless in the pale gold light, lined shoulder to shoulder beyond her porch, their horses dark and still as carved figures. Feathers stirred in the morning breeze. Sunlight caught silver beads, rawhide braids, painted shields hanging quiet. At their front stood a broad-shouldered elder with weathered eyes older than drought. He stepped forward without hurry, bent low, and laid something at her doorstep. It was a small leather charm darkened by river water, threaded with a turquoise bead streaked red with old clay. Willa's breath caught in her throat. She knew that charm. She had untied it from a frightened boy's wrist yesterday while dragging him through floodwater. Her fingers touched the doorframe as her knees nearly gave way. The old warrior looked at her as if measuring something sacred. Then, to her terror, he lowered himself to one knee. Behind him, one after another, all 40 warriors did the same. Dust lifted around them in little spirals. No one spoke, and somehow the silence felt heavier than gunfire. Willa thought she had stepped into a dream born from hunger. Yesterday she had been at the river washing her one faded dress when she heard crying over the rush of spring runoff. A native boy no older than 10 had stood stranded on a gravel bar, one leg dragging, current chewing at the banks around him. Most grown men would have turned back from that water. Willa had gone in without thinking. The river climbed to her chest, cold as mountain snow melt, pulling hard enough to spin her sideways. But she held the boy against her shoulder and fought for shore inch by inch. Afterward, she gave him half a cornbread heel she meant to save for supper. The boy had stared at her with solemn black eyes and whispered, "My father will hear of this." Then he vanished into the cottonwoods before dusk. All-night neighbors' warnings had haunted her. If he belonged to a war chief, they said, trouble would follow. Now trouble stood kneeling at her door. And yet something in the old warrior's face held no hatred, only grave purpose. Then, from the far edge of the line, a small figure stepped forward on a limp she knew at once. The boy emerged from among the riders alive, carrying a bundle wrapped in buckskin, and when his eyes met hers, Willa felt the morning change. But before he could speak, distant hoofbeats sounded from the eastern ridge, fast and many, and every warrior slowly turned. The riders on the eastern ridge came hard through rising dust, 6 settlers from Dry Creek with rifles slung and fear already ahead of them. Willa felt the morning tighten like a drawn wire. The kneeling warriors did not rise in anger. They waited. That unsettled her more than shouting ever could. Chief Nantan stood slowly and lifted one hand, palm outward, as calm as a preacher before a storm. Then Takota limped across the yard toward her porch, each step deliberate, carrying the buckskin bundle against his chest as if it held something breakable. Willa pushed the door wider though her hands still shook. Up close the boy looked smaller than she remembered, dark hair wind-blown, one trouser leg tied above a brace of willow splints she had fashioned at the river. There was river clay still caught in the stitching. He stopped at the bottom step and looked up with the solemn gravity children sometimes carry when life has shown them too much too early. "I told my father," he said softly. His English was careful, shaped with effort. The riders from Dry Creek reined up beyond the warriors, horses restless, men muttering. Willa recognized Amos Pike, the blacksmith, and old Reverend Boone clutching his hat against the wind. Amos shouted first, "Girl, step back from them." But no one moved. Chief Nantan turned only his eyes toward the settlers, and somehow that was enough to quiet even Amos. Then Takota opened the bundle. Inside lay a loaf of dark mesquite bread, still warm, wrapped beside a folded strip of red cloth stitched with turquoise beads. Willa stared, confused. My mother baked this at dawn, Dakota said. She says one who shares her last bread must never eat alone again. The words hit Willa harder than fear had. Yesterday, she had given him half a stale cornbread crust, embarrassed by how little she had to offer. She had thought the boy too hungry even to notice. But he had noticed everything. Chief Nanton stepped forward, and his voice rolled deep and measured over the yard. My son crossed death water on the back of an orphan child. We came to honor a debt. The settlers exchanged uncertain glances. This was not the raid their imaginations had built overnight. Nantan pointed toward Willa's leaking roof, the split fence, the dying patch of corn chewed thin by drought. No child should stand alone here. At his words, several warriors dismounted. One carried cedar poles. Another uncoiled rawhide rope. One older woman, wrapped in blue trade cloth, approached Willa with eyes bright as coals and tied the red beaded cloth around the girl's wrist. It was not jewelry. It felt like belonging. Yet tension still hovered at the ridge. Amos Pike shifted in his saddle, suspicious men slow to surrender old stories. Then Reverend Boone cleared his throat and said, half to himself, maybe the Lord sends miracles wearing feathers too. A ripple almost like laughter moved through the warriors. Willa looked from Dakota to the 40 riders and felt something unfamiliar loosen in her chest. Not safety exactly. Something rarer. The feeling of being seen. But before the first cedar post could be raised, a rider appeared far off along the creek bed waving his hat in warning, and Chief Nanton's expression changed as if some older memory had stirred. The lone rider along the creek bed came lathered in dust, his horse heaving, its flanks dark with sweat. He did not slow until he reached Chief Nantan, then leaned low from the saddle and spoke in Apache too fast for Willa to catch. But she saw the words land like stones. Nanton's weathered face did not harden. It grew still, and stillness on an old man can be heavier than anger. Dakota looked up at his father, suddenly no longer a child receiving gifts but a son listening for danger. Even the wind seemed to pause in the cottonwoods. Amos Pike tightened his reins. What is it? He called. Nanton turned toward the settlers and answered in plain English. Men from the trading post ride this way. They carry papers claiming this land belongs to a railroad syndicate now. The words stirred unease across both groups. Dry Creek had heard rumors for months. Whispers of surveyors buying valleys from men who never set foot in them. Willa looked at her cabin, no bigger than 12 feet by 16, patched with scrap timber and prayer, and could not imagine anyone wanting such a poor little place. Yet Reverend Boone removed his spectacles and murmured, land does not stay worthless once rich men want a route through it. The old woman in blue trade cloth touched Willa's shoulder and gave a faint knowing nod, as if she had seen storms begin this way before. Chief Nanton spoke again, low and deliberate. There is a spring beneath this hill, sacred to my people, valuable to railroad men. Willa remembered her late father once saying water was worth more than silver west of the Mississippi. She had been too young to understand. Now understanding came cold. Dakota stepped closer and whispered, my father says kindness opens one door, but greed often rides through another. Before Willa could answer, a distant glint appeared on the ridge. 3 wagons. For mounted men. Their approach stirred dust like smoke. Yet no panic moved through the 40 warriors. Instead, they began working with greater purpose. Cedar poles rose. Rawhide lashed beams. 2 men repaired her sagging porch as if racing time itself. The settlers, almost without deciding, joined in. Amos Pike hammered split rails back into place. Reverend Boone hauled water. A strange fellowship formed in minutes, born not from trust but necessity. Willa stood in the middle of it holding the warm mesquite loaf, unable to grasp how yesterday she had been alone in the world, and today 40 warriors and half a town moved to guard her roof. Then Dakota reached into his shirt and drew out a small stone pendant carved with a spiral. My grandmother wore this, he said. It marks those under tribal protection. He pressed it into her palm. The stone held desert warmth though morning air had turned cool. Willa felt a tremor move through her, some old orphan hunger meeting something almost like family. But the approaching wagons kept coming. Their lead rider wore a black coat despite the heat, the kind of man who measured land by signatures and souls by profit. As he neared, He raised a rolled paper and called out that all occupants must vacate by federal order before sundown. No weapon was drawn. No shout answered him. Yet a greater confrontation settled over the yard, because 40 kneeling warriors had come to honor a debt, and now Willa understood the debt was becoming something larger than gratitude. It was becoming a line no one intended to let be crossed. The man in the black coat sat straight in his saddle as though dust itself should make room for him. His name, Amos Pike whispered under his breath, was Silas Creed, an agent for the Red Basin Railroad, known from Kansas clear to Arizona territory for buying what was not for sale. Silas unrolled the paper again and held it up as if ink carried more authority than the people standing before him. Federal claim, he announced. This hill and all improvements transfer by lawful survey. His words drifted over cedar smoke and morning wind, but nobody moved from the yard. Chief Nantan stepped forward one pace, boots sinking in soft dust, and looked not at the paper but at the man holding it. A spring cannot be owned by a signature, he said. Silas gave a dry smile meant for courtrooms and frightened farmers. Everything can be owned. Willa felt the old fear creep back. Men with polished boots had once taken her. Father's cattle through debt, papers no child could read. Paper had made her an orphan as surely as fever had. Yet something in her had shifted since dawn. Her fingers closed around the spiral pendant hidden in her palm. Takota stood beside her, small shoulder brushing hers, and she realized she was no longer standing alone at the threshold. Silas glanced at the 40 warriors and seemed almost amused. You bring a tribe to defend a shack worth $15? Reverend Boone answered before anyone else could. Sometimes a shack shelters something wealthier than money. A hush followed. Even Silas paused. Then from one of the wagons his clerk climbed down carrying survey stakes, thin red flags tied to each. He started toward the spring rise. Before he reached it, the old Apache woman in blue stepped silently into his path. She said nothing, simply planted her walking stick into the dirt beside the first flag. The gesture held such quiet certainty the clerk stopped cold. Amos Pike muttered, I would not move that stick for all the gold in Denver. A strange smile touched Chief Nanton's mouth. For the first time all morning, Willa saw humor in him. But Silas Creed was not a man accustomed to stillness resisting him. He looked toward Willa directly. Girl, sign relocation papers, and I will see you placed in town. Willa heard herself answer before fear could stop her. This is my home. Her own voice surprised her, thin but steady. Takota looked at her as if hearing prophecy. The railroad man studied the child he had expected to fold. Then he said softly, Children are often persuaded by what they need. It was not a threat exactly, but something colder. Chief Nanton's gaze sharpened. He motioned, and one warrior brought forward a worn deerskin pouch. From it the chief withdrew a folded treaty older than any living man there, edges brittle, government seal faded but visible. He handed it to Reverend Boone, who adjusted his spectacles and read aloud that these spring lands were protected Apache trust ground, never ceded for settlement or rail. Silence rippled wider than the valley. Even Silas Creed blinked. Where did you get this? He asked. Nantan answered, From men who forgot we remember. For one long moment wind moved through cottonwoods with a sound like distant surf. Then Takota tugged Willa's sleeve and pointed toward the horizon westward. More riders were appearing, not armed men, but Apache families, women and elders and children, coming in a slow line toward the hill. 40 had arrived at dawn. Now there were many more, and Willa understood the dead of one rescued boy was turning into something no railroad had expected to face. The line of riders from the west stretched longer until it seemed the desert itself was moving. Women wrapped in woven shawls rode beside gray-haired elders. Children sat before their mothers on painted ponies. No war party ever looked like this. This was a people arriving to witness something sacred. Silas Creed turned in his saddle, and for the first time uncertainty slipped through his polished calm. He had come to remove an orphan from a forgotten hill. Instead, he faced memory older than railroads. Chief Nantan watched the procession approach, then looked toward Willa as though some decision had ripened. Today, he said, a debt is spoken before witnesses. The Apache families formed a wide half-circle around the spring rise. No shouted orders. No ceremony anyone announced. Yet everything carried the weight of ritual. The old woman in blue stepped to Willa and brushed dust from the girl's sleeve as tenderly as a grandmother. Dakota smiled for the first time since dawn. My grandmother says the earth hears gratitude when people speak it aloud. Then Chief Nantan raised both hands, and all sound fell away, even horses settling quiet. He told the story in English so settlers and railroad men alike would hear it. He spoke of a boy trapped by flood, of a white orphan child who crossed death water carrying another mother's son, of bread shared when there was almost none. His voice was slow, each word laid down like stones in a crossing. Willa felt heat rise behind her eyes. She had done nothing heroic in her own mind. She had only done what loneliness had taught her, that hungry people help the hungry. Yet in the chief's telling it sounded larger, almost legendary. When he finished, too, elders brought forward a folded blanket stitched with red mesa patterns and draped it over Willa's shoulders. The wool carried cedar smoke and sunlight. Murmurs moved through the gathered families. Then Chief Nantan spoke words that made even Reverend Boone remove his hat. By rescue given without bargain. This child is named Daughter of Red Mesa. Willa could barely breathe. Amos Pike whispered, I have lived 50 years and never seen an adoption made by two worlds at once. Dakota stepped near and placed in her hand a tiny carved horse of mesquite wood. My mother made this for children under protection. It was rough and simple, yet Willa held it as if gold. Silas Creed interrupted, his voice thinner now. Ceremony does not overturn claims. But Reverend Boone lifted the old treaty. Nor does greed erase law. To Willa's astonishment, Amos Pike rode forward and planted himself beside Chief Nantan. Then another settler joined him. Then another. A line formed without command, white ranchers beside Apache riders, shoulder to shoulder before the spring. Silas looked at the numbers and understood force would not serve him here. Yet he was not beaten. He nodded to his clerk, who whispered something urgent and pointed toward the valley road. Dust rose again. A federal marshal's buggy was approaching. New law entering old memory. Willa's heart sank, thinking the miracle might break before noon. But the old woman in blue only smiled, deep lines folding like dry riverbeds. Good, she said. Let more eyes see what kindness built. And as the marshal drew near, Dakota leaned close and whispered a secret that made Willa stare. The spring beneath her cabin, he said, was where his people believed lost children were led home. Suddenly the little shack, the poor hill, the 40 knocks at dawn, none of it felt accidental. It felt chosen. The federal marshal arrived in a buckboard coated with trail dust, a broad man in a tan coat, whose silver badge flashed each time sunlight struck it through the cottonwoods. He climbed down slow, not with the swagger of Silas Creed, but with the caution of a man sensing he had stepped into something older than his orders. His name, Reverend Boone whispered, was Elias Mercer, once a circuit judge before he took federal commission. Mercer looked first at the 40 warriors, then the settlers standing beside them, then the orphan girl wrapped in a red mesa blanket. Whatever scene he expected, this was not it. Silas Creed urged his horse forward and began speaking at once, waving claims and surveys, his words tumbling with practiced certainty. Mercer listened without expression. Then Chief Nantan offered the weather treaty. The marshal studied the seal a long while. Wind moved dust in little rings around his boots. Finally he said, almost to himself, I have seen many men wave newer papers to bury older truths. A murmur drifted through both settlers and Apache alike. Yet Mercer was no dreamer. He looked toward the spring rise and said, disputes over federal routes are not settled by sentiment. The words chilled Willa. For a moment she thought all this wonder might still dissolve under distant authority. But then Dakota stepped forward on his braced leg and did something none expected. He handed the marshal the little mesquite horse. Mercer stared at the toy in his weathered palm. Why give me this? He asked. Dakota answered, because my father says men remember justice better when holding what belongs to a child. Even Silas Creed went quiet. Something shifted in Mercer's face, some old memory perhaps. He knelt to Willa's height and asked who had built the cabin. My pa, she said, with boards hauled 8 miles by mule. Mercer looked at the patched roof Apache hands were repairing, at settlers lifting rails beside warriors, and something like respect settled over him. Then from one wagon, the railroad clerk hurried forward carrying maps. He spread them on a barrel, and pointed to a bold red line showing the proposed rail cutting straight through the spring. Mercer frowned. This route was amended? The clerk hesitated too long. Reverend Boone leaned closer and whispered, "Now truth shows its boots." Mercer demanded the original filing. None could produce it. Even Amos Pike understood what that silence meant. The route had been altered for profit. Silas Creed's polished certainty began to crack. Yet rather than condemn him, Mercer did something stranger. He asked Willa to walk him to the spring. Together they climbed the rise. Water bubbled clear from stone, thin but steady, reflecting sky bright as new tin. Willa told him how her father called it the only sweet water for 10 miles. The marshal drank from his hand, then stood silent. "Railroad men call this a resource," he said. "My mother would have called it a blessing." When they returned, Mercer faced the gathering and announced a temporary stay on all claims until territorial review. Relief moved through the crowd like rain sent before a storm. But Silas Creed only smiled, too calm for a beaten man. "Territorial review meets in Tucson," he said, "and poor orphans do not win in court." His words cast a shadow. Then Chief Nantan turned to Willa and said, "Perhaps not alone." He raised his hand, and from among the Apache families an elder woman stepped forward carrying a wrapped bundle of old documents and letters tied in blue ribbon. "Your father left more than a cabin," she told Willa. "He left a truth no one told you." And when the bundle was placed in the orphan girl's hands, even the marshal leaned closer. Willa turned the blue ribbon in her fingers as though touching something alive. The bundle smelled faintly of cedar and old paper, the scent of trunks unopened for years. Chief Nantan nodded for her to untie it. Inside lay 3 folded letters, a deed yellowed with age, and a small journal wrapped in oilcloth. The handwriting across the first letter was one she knew without knowing how she knew it. Her father's. Her breath caught so sharply even Dakota looked up. She had been told after his fevered death there had been nothing left but debts and a mule. Yet here lay pages in the hand that once taught her how to read numbers scratched in dirt. Marshal Mercer removed his hat as she opened the first letter. Her voice trembled reading aloud. It spoke of a spring protected in trust between one rancher, Jonah Carter, and Red Mesa Apache elders after a winter when her father had sheltered tribal families in a blizzard. Willa stopped, stunned. Her father had never told those stories. Perhaps he had. Thought her too young. Perhaps he had meant to, and time had outrun him. Reverend Boone read the deed next, and his voice rose at the final line. The cabin parcel and spring use rights were lawfully transferred not merely to Jonah Carter, but to his direct heirs under territorial covenant. Amos Pike let out a low whistle. "Girl, you own the ground the railroad claims." Even Silas Creed lost color. Yet it was the journal that changed everything. Inside, among weathered sketches of the spring and old trail routes, one page held a note written in another hand, Apache script beside English translation. Chief Nannan recognized it at once. It had been written by his own father. "To the Carter blood," Boone read, "who guarded our children in hunger, Red Mesa shall guard yours in return." No oath could have carried greater weight there. Willa stood silent, tears bright but unshed, because orphanhood had always felt like being cut loose from any story before you began. Now a story was finding her. Dakota leaned close and whispered, "I told you this hill was where lost children are led home." Marshal Mercer turned towards Silas Creed. "There will be no rail crossing here." But Silas made one last attempt. He claimed signatures could be forged, alliances invented. Then the old woman in blue stepped forward and from around her neck removed a silver locket worn smooth by decades. Inside was a faded daguerreotype. A young Jonah Carter stood beside an Apache elder at this very spring. Proof no court could easily ignore. Mercer studied it a long moment, then handed it back with reverence. "Some evidence carries law," he said, "and some carries honor. This is both." Even the railroad clerk lowered his eyes. Yet the deeper twist came when Chief Nantan addressed the gathering. He said Red Mesa had kept one final custom unfulfilled for generations. A child once named under tribal protection must be given a place among the people. He motioned toward the repaired cabin, now ringed with fresh cedar posts. "This house stands on 2 promises," he said. "White hands built it. Apache hands saved it. Let no man divide what kindness joined." Then, to Willa's amazement, Amos Pike removed his. hat and said he and the Dry Creek settlers would ride with her to Tucson when review came. One orphan had become a cause. But as afternoon sun lowered, Marshal Mercer unfolded a telegram just delivered by courier, scanned it once, and frowned. Territorial review had been moved forward. Hearing opened in 3 days. And Tucson was more than 200 miles away. 200 miles in 3 days would have broken most grown men, much less an orphan girl. But Chief Nantan did not look troubled. He looked almost as if he had expected the desert to demand one more test. As twilight spread copper across the spring, he called for fresh horses. What followed moved with the strange swiftness of old loyalties. Apache riders brought remounts from hidden grazing folds. Amos Pike volunteered a buckboard strong enough for papers and provisions. Reverend Boone packed jerked venison and hard bread while the old woman in blue tucked medicinal herbs into Willa's satchel for road spirits. She said, though whether she meant sickness or sorrow, Willa could not tell. The poor hill that had been lonely at dawn now hummed like a frontier camp preparing for pilgrimage. Marshal Mercer studied maps by lantern light and traced a route through canyons, avoiding rail stations where Silas Creed might delay them. If we ride in relays, he said, we can make Tucson. Willa stood beside Dakota under a sky filling with stars and felt life turning too quickly to hold. Yesterday, she had feared winter hunger. Tonight, she was riding to defend land in territorial court. It felt impossible. Dakota handed her a small buckskin pouch. Open it when fear comes, he said. She slipped it into her dress pocket beside her father's letters. At moonrise they departed, a strange caravan of settlers, Apache riders, a federal marshal, and one orphan wrapped in red mesa colors. Hooves drummed dry earth in a rhythm older than speech. By dawn they crossed sandstone bluffs where sunlight broke in sheets over the desert floor. Willa rode before Amos Pike in the buckboard, reading her father's journal aloud whenever camp pauses allowed. Each page seemed to braid 2 histories she had been taught were separate. 1 entry spoke of red mesa women nursing her mother through fever. Another told how Jonah Carter refused payment for shelter, saying neighbors do not invoice storms. Chief Nantan listened in silence. But once Willa saw tears glint in his old eyes. On the second day, a dust storm rose hard from the south, swallowing trail markers. For hours, riders vanished and reappeared like ghosts in red wind. Fear pressed in, but Willa remembered Dakota's pouch. She opened it. Inside lay a pinch of spring earth and a tiny note in his careful hand. Home rides with you. Something in her steadied. By the third sunrise, Tucson shimmered ahead. Church spires and courthouse cupola rising from mesquite haze. Yet another surprise waited. At the courthouse square, dozens had gathered already, word of the orphan and the spring somehow outrunning them. Ranchers from neighboring valleys stood there. Apache delegates from other bands too. Even newspaper men with notebooks. Silas Creed arrived confident again, flanked by attorneys in black coats. He smiled at Willa as though expecting a child to wilt beneath polished law. But when the hearing opened, Marshal Mercer submitted the treaty, the deed, the locket photograph, and Jonah Carter's journal into record. Then Chief Nantan did something no one foresaw. He rose and declared before judge and crowd that Red Mesa would transfer shared guardianship of the spring to Willa May Carter by tribal witness. A white orphan became, in one moment, bridge and beneficiary. Murmurs filled the chamber. The judge leaned forward, intrigued. Yet just before ruling, he asked one final question. Why, he said, looking at Willa, should this court trust a child with land men have fought over for decades? And every eye turned toward the girl who once owned almost nothing. The courtroom held stillness the way desert basins hold heat after sundown. Even Silas Creed stopped shifting papers. The judge's question hung in the room, not hostile, only grave. Why trust a child with land men had fought over for decades? Willa felt every eye upon her, but fear did not rise as it once had. She thought of floodwater at her chest, of 40 knocks at dawn, of a warm loaf placed in her hands, of her father's hidden letters, of Dakota's note folded beside spring earth. Then she answered in a voice small, but clear enough to carry to the back wall. Because I did not ask for this land. I only tried to help a boy across a river. If something so small could bring all these people together, maybe this place belongs to those who protect it, not those who profit from it. No flourish followed. No rehearsed argument. Just truth spoken plain. Yet the silence afterward felt changed. The judge leaned back and looked from the orphan girl to the Apache chief, to settlers standing beside tribal elders, to Marshal Mercer, who gave the slightest nod. At length the judge removed his spectacles and said he had spent 30 years hearing men claim ownership through force, debt, and clever law, but seldom had he seen ownership proven through stewardship. His ruling came almost softly. The rail claim was void. The spring covenant stood. Custodial title would remain with Willa May Carter under territorial protection, with Red Mesa recognized co-guardian by treaty right. For a moment no one moved, as if understanding took time to cross the room. Then Reverend Boone laughed aloud through tears. Amos Pike gripped his hat to his chest. Chief Nanton closed his eyes in quiet gratitude. Even the judge smiled when Takota whispered something in Apache that made elders nod. Silas Creed gathered his papers without protest, smaller somehow than when he entered, and left by a side door no one watched. Some defeats make no sound. The journey home felt slower, not from hardship, but from fullness. They rode beneath autumn lights spilling bronze across the mesas. At the hill spring, settlers and Apache families raised a proper cabin beside the old one, cedar-framed, wide-porched, with a stone ring around the water source so travelers could drink. No toll was ever asked. Years passed as frontier years do, measured by droughts, foalings, and winters survived. Willa grew, though old-timers still called her the orphan girl long after she owned more acres than any imagined. Yet she never let fences close the spring. Every spring thaw, Red Mesa riders came to renew the covenant. Dry Creek families came too. Children of both peoples ran the banks together where once adults had feared each other. And beside the cabin door, under the porch beam, 40 red handprints were pressed in clay and sealed against weather. Travelers asked what they meant. Some said they marked the warriors who once arrived in silence. Others said they were a warning that greed should turn back. Willa always answered only, "They remind me what one kindness can awaken." In old age, Chief Nantan sat many evenings by her fire while wind moved through cottonwoods and coyotes called from the ridges. On the night he died, he told her justice in the west rarely rode in loud. It arrived quiet, like someone knocking before dawn. After he was gone, Willa found the mesquite horse Takota had given her still on the mantle, worn smooth by decades of touch. And long after railroad maps yellowed and Silas Creed was forgotten, riders crossing that territory still stopped at the Carter Spring, where water ran cold and free. Some swore if you came before sunrise, when the light was barely silver, you could see 40 shadows near the porch standing watch. Maybe legend made that part larger. Or maybe some debts are meant never to end. Out there, people said the spring was protected by law. But those who knew better said it was protected by bread shared in hunger, by a child carried through floodwater, and by the day 40 warriors knocked at a poor girl's door and left the whole frontier changed.